Just going to head into the Museum of Somerset in Taunton, situated in the remains of Taunton Castle. Lots of fascinating things to see inside of here. While we're here, I'm just going to show you a few of my favourite things situated in this museum. And here is one of my favourites, the Froom Hoard. Probably because I used to have such a love of metal detecting, and this was one of the earliest sort of hoards that I learnt about. Could this have been one wealthy person's savings? Or perhaps more likely it was somewhat of a bank. And the reason it was placed in the ground was that people would come and treat it as a bank. They would drop off coins, they would collect their coins. Maybe there was somebody there looking after this pot of money, keeping notes as to who owed what and who had taken what. Obviously it's just a theory, no one really knows. It could be that it was used for payment of soldiers and things like that, but nobody really knows. What do you think that the Froom Hoard was used for? Another interesting fact is that out of 52,503 coins, only 5 was actually silver. Another of my favourites might come as a surprise. It's not made of gold, it's not got any particular financial value, it's just made of wood. But what I love is the social aspect behind it. So you can see here we've got a little axe made of wood, and it's likely this would have been made as a child's toy, which I find absolutely fascinating. For me, this sort of thing, little children's axe, is just showing us that actually people always cared about their children. They always had the same connections with their family that we've got today, regardless of how long ago it was. So isn't it fascinating to think this toy axe, as it says there, from 3,800 BC, that's almost 6,000 years ago. 6,000 years ago there was a child watching his father use an axe, and as kids do today, they want to imitate their influences, their father, and he clearly wanted his father to make him his own little axe, so that's what he did. So here's another fascinating discovery. This is from the Somerset Levels, and it's known as a bog boat. Now the Somerset Levels historically, especially in ancient times, was very, very wet, known as essentially a marshland, and being situated below sea level, and the people needed to be able to get around. And aside from the trackways, you've got the famous sweet track and things like that. This is what people would have used to get from one location to another, a bog boat. So the Somerset Levels is home to all sorts of fascinating discoveries, just like this one, that if left anywhere else probably would have completely been destroyed, and that's because of the conditions that it was left in. So Somerset Levels being essentially peat, it creates anaerobic conditions. So things like this bog boat, when it fell out of use and it was left somewhere, it would have eventually been covered in peat, like I said, which would have created these anaerobic conditions, which essentially means that oxygen could not penetrate the peat, which means bacteria couldn't get into things like the boat. So it means it has been preserved for us to find in future generations. The only trouble with that is that as time progresses and the Somerset Levels gets even more drained, we are at risk of losing many, many more archaeological discoveries like that have still gone undiscovered. But hey ho, there we go. At least we've got this one here to have a look at. But isn't it fascinating to think that 4,000 to 6,000 years ago, this very boat here that was carved out of a trunk was actually used by people on the Somerset Levels to get about. It was their transportation, which I think is fascinating. Here is another really interesting discovery. It's actually the skeleton of a woman from Roman times, between 100 200 AD, found in Stogursey. But what makes this one really interesting is who she was buried with. And that is her dog, that you can see just there. And here we have the beautiful Anglo-Saxon Cheddar brooch, discovered in Cheddar, which was actually home of a royal Saxon lodge, hunting lodge. What a beautiful piece, beautiful discovery. And here we have the Alfred jewel. This one is a replica, but still beautiful to see nonetheless. This has got to be another one of my favourites. Probably because I love that whole period in history, Alfred the Great saving Wessex from the Vikings, and how this very thing, in some ways, ties in with that. So around the edge of it, the words translate as "Alfred had me made," and some speculate perhaps this was created as a gift for the lady who allowed Alfred to lodge in her house when he burnt those cakes. Famous story relating to Alfred the Great. More likely, it was probably gifted to somebody close to him and used as a pointer. So it's believed there would have been like a wooden pointer coming out this end, and this would have just acted as a handle, and it would have been used to read, point. We got this here. Imagine my finger is the pointer, and we've used it to follow along and read. Something else I really enjoy seeing is these old carved wooden screens and pew ends and things like that from our past. It's a really interesting one. Some have really interesting symbolism and they tell stories. This one, I think, is mostly saints. You can see they've lost their faces, probably during the English Civil War when Cromwell ordered many of his troops to deface any saints and things like that. The belief being that worshipping any what they called false idols takes away from your real true love of God. But I digress. The thing I find really interesting about this one is at one point it ended up being used on a farm, and if you look closely you can see where the farmer has actually cut a hole out to allow his chickens to get from one side to the other. So that's sad to see, but thank goodness we've still got the rest of it to look at. So something else I find fascinating, although it's extremely random, is these plates. I don't know what it is. These William and Mary plates showing King William and Mary, William III. And I don't know what it is. I just have a strange fascination with these plates. If we go through this place, New Horizons, this bit is called. It shows you lots of interesting discoveries, not quite as ancient as the other ones we've been looking at. These are more from the times of colonialism, the curious things they picked up on their travels. There's one thing in particular I was just going to quickly show you. That is the shrunken heads. Isn't it fascinating to think there was a period in time where tribal warriors, they would take the head of their enemies and wear it as a trophy. And we always knew the best warriors because they had the most heads attached to their waist. Beautiful old painting of St Mary's there. We are now going to enter into the Monmouth Rebellion area. Beautiful old fireplace just there. But let's look inside here. Of course, massive part of Somerset's past, the Monmouth Rebellion. An interesting plate there from 1680 which celebrates conjoined twins. Here we have a really interesting document, and this lists people who was absent from their homes during the Battle of Sedgemoor, and they had to sort of account for where they was or stand trial. Here's an old locket that was actually found on the battlefield. It shows King Charles II on one side and his queen on the other. Interesting swords here that was discovered on the battlefield. Found in Sedgemoor. Here we have the hanging Judge Geoffrey. He's got his name for sentencing so many people to be hanged during his lifetime, especially during the Monmouth Rebellion. Lovely old musket there. We've got some old cannonballs, a powder flask just here. Oh, and these things here, the pike heads. You know, as if a pointy thing wasn't enough. Adding all of this extra stuff is pretty horrendous. You would not want that going through your body, that's for certain. And it's fascinating to think, you know, just a few hundred years ago, on a field in Somerset, not far away from here, things like that was being used on people from this very area. And here we have a plate that celebrates the Maids of Taunton. Now this is a forgotten part of the Monmouth Rebellion. When Monmouth first came to Taunton, before the Battle of Sedgemoor, it said that he was welcomed by the people of Taunton. In fact, many young girls from the area got together, made big banners to welcome him, and they was later described as the Maids of Taunton, which is what is depicted just here. And to finish off, we have the Duke of Monmouth himself. But there we go. Fascinating things to see in there. Well worth a visit, so I would definitely recommend coming to Taunton Castle and checking it out. Please.